Shalom, which means peace, and greetings, friends. Someone on Facebook recently told me that I needed to read the Bible. Well, I got it here, and I've read it, and I thank you out there if you're listening, because although I've read it, every time I read it again, I get more out of it. And I want to encourage all of you out there, every one of you, to read the Scriptures more frequently. I wish I could, and I try to, but we all can improve, and we can all learn and grow. It's a lifelong process of learning and growing and thinking outside the box of whatever form of religion, whether it be in Judaism or Christianity or whatever other religion out there you come from. Think outside that box and think for yourself. I'd like to encourage you to do that. I try to do that myself. And the reason that comment was made to me, one of the reasons, was because sometimes I use the name Shaul along with the name Paul for the Apostle Paul. And because I do that, I want to educate others, and it stimulated this video teaching to help dedicated to educating others on why the name Shaul or Paul or Saul can be used at different times, and why so? Why do I? Or why do some others you might listen to out there? Because it is a common understanding within Christianity that Paul's name was Saul before he converted to Christianity. You know, in Judaism it was Saul, like we have the king, the first king of Israel was Saul, and then it changed to Paul. And so, although that is a common understanding, such is actually perhaps not true. And that's what I want to delve into here and try to understand that yes, names do change. Sometimes the Almighty does change the names when a person's spiritual level of relationship or covenant increases to a higher level. We see that with Abram, being changed to Abraham because he became at the covenant a father of many nations, even though he didn't have any children yet. He was called past tense. You look at it, he was called a father of many nations. That's what his name. And Sarai was changed to Sarah because she is to be a mother of many nations and kings and future royalty. In that covenant, we see Jacob. His name was changed to Israel, and in his Hebrew name, Jacob, Yaakov, means like a heel grabber. Sounds a little bit more like, an unconverted name, or however you want to word that, but his name was changed to Israel, which in Hebrew means you're a prevailer with the Almighty and with humanity, or you're a champion. And so the word Israel, we shouldn't be anti-Semitic about it. It doesn't mean, technically, it doesn't mean Jewish or anything like that. It simply means you are a champion. You are a prevailer. And so that's a wonderful name to become an Israelite, a champion. And so that is also part of the new covenant. As you read Romans chapter 11, verse 11 and onward, we are to be grafted into that same tree. And in Gentiles, we've got to come off the wild tree, cut off the wild tree, and put onto the holy tree. And that's another story. But let's get back to the story of changing names. Sometimes we see faithful people in the Bible, their names are changed from a Hebrew name also to a more Babylonian name or a Greek name or a Latin name. For example, Hadassah. Who was Hadassah? And those of you who know your Torah, know your scriptures a little more, and the stories, Hadassah, her name was changed to Esther. Now Esther is a Babylonian name coming from Greek, or I shouldn't say Greek, but a pagan god. We have the Esther, the Easter, the Ishtar, and different variations and different names and different cultures may pronounce it a little bit differently, but we see most people know her as Esther. They don't know her as as Hadassah. And so, we don't see that considered a sin in the scriptures or against the Torah to use different names in different cultures. But like I said, it's popularly assumed that Paul's name was changed when he converted to accept the Messiah, who his Hebrew name is Yeshua. And most people, from the Greek to Latin to English, call his name Jesus. And so we see another name change, not because the Messiah did any kind of a conversion to a higher level of spirituality, but we see just names can kind of change depending on the culture and the language that is using them. So let's look at the Hebrew name for Saul. Now, for those of you who don't know the Hebrew alphabet, and many of you do, listening to this do, know that there's 22 letters, and one of those letters is the word is a letter for S or SH or S or sh. And so it looks like a W actually. And 2,000 years ago, they didn't put vowel letters in with those letters, so it could have been the letter W in Hebrew could be pronounced as an S or an SH. So you can say Sabbath or Shabbath or Shabbat, and so, or some people say Chavez, depending on the Hebrew dialect. If you're getting back to the Hebrew, but by about the 3rd century CE or AD, however you want to word that, we see that the sages realized we need to start putting in little code dots and strikes here to put in how to pronounce the vowels, because people are losing the pronunciation. There's so many dialects developing. So eventually, they put a dot. So if you put a dot on this side of the W, it could mean a sh. But if you put the dot on the top on the other side of the W, it would be a s. And so, but they didn't have this back then. So in the 1st century, the apostle Shaul's name, or Saul, could have been pronounced either way. And so there's no need to get overly dogmatic. Some people get into sacred names and you have to pronounce everything exactly the way they think it is. But as you study the ancient language, there's different dialects that have somewhat evolved, and so it's hard to say who's the original Hebrew dialect. And so it can be a little bit ambiguous the more scholarly and the more educated we can become on the topic. But how about the name Paul? How did his name become Paul, really, truly? Well, in the testimony in the book of Acts, Paul inherited his Roman citizenship from his father. And so he had Roman citizenship. And so under the Roman Empire, Greek was the dominant language of the time, of the 1st century. And so his Greek name would have been, the biblical Greek would be pronounced, transliterated more so as Paulos, P-A-U-L-O-S. And then in the Latin, it would be Paulus. That's P-A-U-L-U-S. And so, Greek and then Latin became more popular later on. But, most people call him Paul for short. Just like my name is Russell, and a lot of people call me Russ. It's still the same name. We're talking about the same guy. If you're talking about me, you can call me Russ. You can call me Russell. Growing up, people called me Rusty, because I have some freckles and rusty reddish looking hair. So hey, that's okay by me. Just don't call me late for breakfast, okay? But anyway, so we can see Paul here. His name, his Greek name before his conversion was like Paulos or Paul, and that's just like Esther. Hadassah had to take on a Greek name, or not, I should say a Babylonian name at that time. And of course that was the Almighty's way of espionage during that time to have the Persian king marry a Jewish woman to save the Jewish people, and hence we have the Esther story, we have the Esther book. And so in the festival of Purim every year is dedicated on the anniversary of that time period of what the Almighty did through Esther, and many of us still call her Esther. But the more Hebraic people are, they like to restore her more Jewish Hebrew name as Hadassah. And so we shouldn't condemn people either way, because we see the scriptures promoting both ways. And we see this in other empires, other languages, other names. Also under the Babylonian Empire, we have Daniel. Now his name under the Babylonian Empire was Belshazzar. And so you can see that in the book of Daniel. And then remember his three faithful friends. You know, most people know their Babylonian names as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if you watch VeggieTales out there, you see, you know, they call them, Shadrach and Benny. It's kind of cute, and I like the humor in there. But if you restore their Hebrew names or Jewish names, Hananiah, that's Shadrach's original name, and Meshach's original name is Mishael, and Abednego, his Hebrew Jewish name is Azariah. And so why does Daniel, why do we ever know his Hebrew name, but not the other three guys' Hebrew name? Well, my speculation on that is because Daniel, remember, he became second in command under Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar. And so he had established such high rank, authority, and reputation. So I'm sure he had the authority to say, hey guys, I prefer my Hebrew name here. Please call me Daniel, not Belshazzar. Where his other three friends, although they had a great act of miracle, and in time they probably didn't maintain such or gain any kind of authority, and so most people just know their Babylonian names, because the big picture here is the Almighty wants us to learn the spiritual lessons from their faith, from their obedience. Of course, obedience and faith go hand in hand in all these stories of faithful men and women. Not that they were perfect. They all sinned. They all needed grace. We all need mercy and grace, and so did these men and women during ancient times under the old covenants, but they will be granted eternal life because of their faith, and they obeyed the best they understood, the best they could. And we see them taking on Babylonian names and even Greek names. So, you know, why should we think that as being any strange when we look at the name of Paul or Shaul because of his Roman citizenship? So let's get to the book of Acts. Let's look. Did Paul's name change, and did the first century believers in this Messiah change, accept his name change and just go from Saul or Shaul to Paul? Let's take a look at that in the book of Acts, chapter 9. You can see, when Saul or Shaul was on, they call him from Tarsus. He was on his on the road to Damascus to persecute the believers. Here he is out to persecute the believers in Messiah, in Yeshua. And most of you know him as Jesus. And here the Messiah uses not a Greek name, but his Hebrew name, and in his native tongue he says, Shaul, Shaul. Or we could also say, Saul, Saul, why have you been persecuting me? And so we see that in the native tongue, that the Messiah didn't change his name at this point. Or, some might say, well, he wasn't converted yet. He had to be blinded and baptized. And okay, well, let's take a look at that. Let's continue on here. And if you jump down to Acts chapter 9 and verse 17, it was Ananias receives the vision to go meet him. And the Lord referred to him. When the Lord spoke to Ananias, he referred to him as still Shaul or Saul of Tarsus. But then, when Ananias came to restore his sight after the 3 days and 3 days of blindness, he called him brother Shaul, or Saul, depending how you want to pronounce that first Hebrew letter, continuing to utilize the Yah-given Hebrew name. And to even top that off even further, let's go to Acts chapter 13. Let's jump over another 4 chapters later. We see Saul is called Paul for the first time on the island of Cyprus here, much later than the time of his conversion. But however, the author of the book of Acts, most people understand it as Luke, who wrote the book of Luke, and indicates, the author of the book of Acts, whether it be Luke or somebody else, indicates that his name was interchangeable. It didn't change or convert and then the old name was gone, but it was interchangeable. Notice in Acts chapter 13 verses 7 through 9 here, it says, "This man called for Barnabas and Shaul," or Saul, "and sought to hear the word of God." Here this man is seeking that. And in verse 9 he says, "Then Shaul, who is also called Paul." Interesting. You know, he doesn't say, and Paul, who is also known as Shaul or Saul. He actually, the author of Acts, preferred his Hebrew name, his Jewish Hebrew name, more so than the Greek Roman citizenship name that was given to Paul from his birth. So, not that it's, like I said, I'm not saying it's a sin either way, because then throughout the rest of the New Testament, or the Brit Hadashah, as we say in Hebrew, we see his name being Paul being used thereafter. But it's interesting, it didn't just change with his conversion, and we need to understand the origins of where his name came from. It wasn't because he became converted from Judaism to Christianity. You know, that's a false accusation, a false assumption, and misinformation that has been, taught out there. But, if we look to his reputation, even, we look to him as he became the apostle to the Gentiles. He was to reach the Gentile people. And, and I also speculate, because he was persecuting and murdering what many people call the Christians. In the first century, they didn't consider themselves Christians, because that was more of the Greek to Latin name that was given to them. And they just considered themselves as believers. It was a branch of Judaism. The roots of Christianity is Judaism. And they were just, believers accepting the Messiah, the Jewish carpenter, Yeshua, as the Messiah. And so, Greek and Latin names came along, and so the Christians were also, finally accepted that name, Christians, because it's an identifier of who you believe in. And like I said, the big picture are the spiritual lessons, who we believe in, who are we trying to identify, and whether we call her Hadassah or Esther, whether we call him Daniel or Belshazzar, as long as we're talking about the same person, the character, the personality, that's the big picture, not just the technical name or the pronunciation of the name. Now, if the Father reveals to you, something that, isn't easily to prove, that's one thing, but I'm not here to try to say that I know it all, and I don't know it all, but what I'm looking at here is to see that our Father, our Creator, the Almighty, does allow us to use names and titles and identifiers depending on the culture, depending on the language. And as our spiritual understanding increases and we get back to our Hebrew roots, then we can, maybe have more passion for the original names and have more sentimental value in them. But Paul's ministry, his method, was to put people at ease in their culture and in their language, and approach them with a message in a language that they could relate to. So to most Christians, I have no problem saying Jesus. And, it's a wonderful name. And some people say, oh, Jesus. And they get really passionate, emotional. I love getting passionate and emotional about him. And that's a wonderful thing. Yes. And, I get even more passionate to restore his Hebrew name, which means God is salvation. Yahshua means that God is salvation. You can pronounce it in different dialects and different ways, like I said, but I hope we're talking about the same person here, the same being. So, this can also relate to how we pronounce the name of God, or use different titles for him. Because the Apostle Paul, or Shaul, wanted to be all things to all men. And we see him saying that in 1 Corinthians 9. If you turn to 1 Corinthians 9, verses 19 through 22, he says, "For though I am free of all men," or not a slave, there was a lot of slavery back then, and so he is free. He's not a slave to any man. "I have made myself a servant to everybody." And he is here to serve, that I might win more people. Win them over, not just to him or to glorify him, but notice this here. "And to the Jews I became as a Jew." He would use Jewish names and culture and traditions and good things, yes, that I might win those who are Jewish. "And to those who are under the law, as under the law." Now, let me stop for a minute here. The term under the law was an idiom in the first century. If we were all in the first century, I could take you into a time machine. It was a common rabbinic understanding among Judaism as well as the Gentiles who were converting to Judaism that under the law was more also, it was an idiom for being also under the penalties of the law. So if you sinned, you had to be penalized according to the penalty, whether it be the death penalty, whether it be paying back, sevenfold, or whatever the penalty was for certain sins, you had to be penalized when you were under the law. But when you're under grace, well, that's another idiom that was used that, okay, well, you're sorry, you repent, you don't have to be put to death, you don't have to be penalized. And we see King David was under grace. He should have been put to death for what he did to his faithful servant Uriah and committing adultery with Bathsheba. Under the law, that idiom, he should have been put to death, but he was under grace. And we see this, even grace in the Old Covenant. So I just mentioned that in terms to understand when Paul says he would be under the law, that means when he was among Orthodox, sect at the time, yeah, he would support the penalties of the law, but then when he could, he would slip in. Hey, in the Torah, there's grace. Look at King David, and look at these other examples. And he would tie in Messiah when he could. So he would approach people on their culture, their belief systems, not to compromise. I'm not saying that he would compromise with the Torah. He wouldn't sin or do anything wrong, but notice how he was good and inspired in how he would relate to people on the spiritual level that they were at, and not just come out and say, "Oh, you guys are wrong. Here, let me teach you the truth." I mean, he wouldn't just come in and point blank and dogmatic and just blast people where they were wrong or in error with doctrine. He would approach them and help them, fine-tune their understanding and be a little bit more accurate. So when he says here, for those who are under the law, he would be under the law, that he might win those who are under the law. He'd eventually get that grace, showing in the Torah and the Messiah and the gospel all in there. Because the gospel was preached to Israel too. If we believe Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 2, the gospel was preached to Israel. And in Galatians 3:8, it says the gospel was preached to Abraham. So it's the New Testament gospel isn't some brand new gospel that just came out with Jesus and the apostles. It was actually a restored and improved gospel of the same old gospel as we understand it more. But I don't want to get off on a tangents here. Getting back to the context of 1 Corinthians 9 here, and in verse 21 it says, "To those who are without law, I became as without the law." Now notice this is not being without law toward Him, the Almighty. So in other words, he wouldn't sin, he wouldn't, break God's commandments. But to those who didn't understand the Torah, there's people out there who don't know the commandments. They don't know better. He wouldn't just come in and say, "Hey, you guys need to straighten out. You're breaking this commandment. You're sinning here. You're sinning there." No, he would come in on their level, and he would say, "And to those who are weak, I became as weak." People say, "Oh, I've got these addictions. I've got these things I need to overcome." Paul said, "Hey, I'm human too. I have those pulls of the flesh too. But you know what? The Almighty has a powerful helper, and He's helped me come." Galatians 2:20, "It is not I who live, but it is the Messiah. The Spirit of His lives in me. And the life that I live, I'm crucified with Him. I put to death my old self, and I'm no longer a slave to these addictions to sin. I become a slave to righteousness." And so he would show his weakness and show also how to come out of weakness. So he's saying here, not being without law toward God, but under the law toward the Messiah. So here he's saying, this is where he'd bring in Messiah, about being under the law, and how repentance and the sacrificial system was for the forgiveness of sin. And so that, like King David, we can be forgiven. We don't have to be put to death. We don't have to be under the penalties if we have the right attitude and the right spirit of overcoming these things. Not abolishing, the written word here in any way. And he says that I might win those who are without the law. To be weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak ones. And I have become all things to all men. Here's that term, that phrase, all things to all men, that I might by all means save some of them. So he was gifted in the discernment and how to approach people at the spiritual level they were at. And when opportunity arises, he wouldn't just push it or force it to get on a soapbox all the time, but he would interject where he could help progressively lead them. Baby steps, as we say, in overcoming, in a lot of steps of overcoming problems today. Making small steps and gradual steps, not making too big of steps that people just can't jump or are not ready yet for. So Paul was good about that. And that was his goal, that was his attitude, even with his name. Like I said, he gladly accepted his Roman citizenship when it was appropriate, and even his name, and also because people just didn't trust that he would stop killing Christians. They just figured, well, he's just coming in, and he's just coming in as a spy, and he's going to eventually start murdering and persecuting again. So Paul, was willing to adapt and to accept, the reputation he had. He would confess it, but also my assumption is that he preferred the name Paul because it helped him relate to the Gentiles, and that was where his ministry was at. He was the apostle, the emissary to the Gentiles. Now, in the book of Acts chapter 17, notice what Paul does here. He says, "Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus," or however you pronounce that in the Greek, "and said, 'Men of Athens,'" here he is in Athens, "'Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious.'" Yes, they were very religious. And pagan gods, you see, he saw these pagan gods here, the hill of Ares, and all these pagan deities. But then he noticed the sign. He says, "For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar which had this inscription, 'To the unknown God.'" Now it wasn't in Hebrew, it wasn't the Hebrew name for God, but it was a Greek name. Here Paul uses a Greek name of God. Now people who are in a sacred name say, "Oh, that's sin. You can't use God or titles for God or anything." Well, Paul wasn't that, he didn't take that approach here. If you look at it, it says his name, he uses the Greek name, and he says, therefore, the one. He didn't say that they are more than one. He says, the one whom you worship without knowing, he says, him I proclaim to you. And so he came in on their culture using their name and their language, and he would bring them, to the truth. And he would reveal the Hebrew names and his Hebrew name, I'm sure, as people were ready for it. And that's where it takes discernment. But, I don't want to get too speculative about these things, but Paul was good about relating to people's cultures in a way that they could relate without compromising with the commandments, the mitzvot. In 1 Corinthians, let me conclude here. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 33, he also says, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit. It's not about his glory or profit or becoming some kind of a popular evangelist or becoming wealthy and rich. No, he says it's not for his profit, but for the profit of many, that they might be saved. That was the big picture. Whether we're using Babylonian names or Greek, Latin names, the big picture is the truth, the spiritual lessons, the character development. This is what he wants us to learn. And he also taught according to the written Torah. That's how he converted the Bereans. Remember the Bereans? He said, you Bereans are more noble. You study the scriptures daily. And they didn't have the New Testament back then. The Bereans only had what the Christians, most people call the Old Testament. Or we say Tanakh, as the Hebrews say, the Jewish people say Tanakh, the Old Testament. The Bereans, Paul taught according to that. They matched up all his teachings with it, as so should we. And of course, now I'm not saying that Paul pleased everybody. He wasn't just a pleaser of men, and he was persecuted. He still offended a lot of people, and so did the Messiah. Although they strived to win everybody over to the truth sometimes simply offends people. So that's on the other hand there. So, but Paul, the reason he would offend people is because he wouldn't compromise either with the Torah, the written Torah. I'm not talking about the oral law or the oral Torah here, but I'm talking about the written word. He wouldn't compromise with that. Even with names, we don't see any commandments that you can't take on other cultural names or titles. We see even Esther, and we see as I mentioned earlier in this video teaching, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were Babylonian, pagan, you can say names, but they're still being used, and the Almighty does not say it's a sin. It's in trying to help people have reference and credibility to the actual true character and the spiritual lessons and the principles behind it. So Paul was persecuted, yes, because he believed in the written Torah and he believed in Jesus. Or, as his more Hebrew name is, Yeshua. Yeshua HaMashiach, which is also Yeshua the Messiah.